Hello and welcome to our Bible study, continuing study of the Gospel of Matthew. I thought, especially since so much of what is going on with Jesus at this point in this Gospel is happening outside, most of it did, how appropriate to be outside in this beautiful afternoon. And so I hope that you enjoy this outside scenario. This is part 14 of, and it's in book 4 of the 5 books that comprise the Gospel of Matthew. And it is a continuing narrative in this book 4 before we get to the teaching discourse. It's in Matthew chapter 16 today. The first 4 verses of chapter 16, I'll read that beginning and then talk a little bit about that. The Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test Jesus, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, "When it's evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. In the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah." And then he left them and went away. And of course, like me, you're thinking, red sky in the morning, sailor take warning, red sky at night, sailor's delight. We know that from just observing and looking at life in an objective sort of way. But what Jesus was telling these religious leaders is that they were not looking objectively at all. They were not using their minds. They were not using their hearts. They were strictly governed by the rules that they follow and what they think it ought to be, and interpreting everything that way. This segment has a corollary in Mark chapter 8, verses 11 through 13. At least verse 1 and 4 in this section are from that. Now Matthew adds, "and Sadducees." So Mark's version just has, "The Pharisees came, and to test Jesus, asked him to show them a sign of heaven." Jesus' use of weather indicates what common experience dictates. In contrast, the religious leaders were choosing to be blind to the times, blind adherents to their approach, their philosophy, their rules. We can see with the benefit of hindsight the significance of Jesus' ministry, but they were not seeing it then. Now, many people were, common people, the poor, the lame, the injured, the brokenness, the broken people. Many of them were able to see, or they were so desperate they were open to what Jesus said, but not those religious leaders. They were not seeing it. They asked for a sign, even while at the same moment they were ignoring or failing to recognize the sign that was plainly in front of them. Jesus, what he said, what he did. The challenge for us today is to see the sign of our own times. What is the movement of history that we might be missing, or that we might be choosing not to see? We so easily get wrapped up in our own perspective, what our group thinks, what we think is right and wrong, based on often biases that we have. Jesus said the only sign that you'll get is the sign of Jonah. And of course, that refers to the Old Testament story, not so much of the great fish, the whale that swallowed Jonah, though that's part of the story we remember the most, but the story in which the people of Nineveh, the capital city of that great empire, Assyria, were challenged to repent and turn to God. And they recognized the truth of what Jonah was saying, and they repented, believed him, and turned to God. Going on, verses 5 through 12. When the disciples reached the other side, now of course, Jesus was with them, we have to figure, because that's what it says. It said he left them and went away, and the disciples reached the other side. I guess another alternative is that Jesus had gone on, left them, and was waiting for them at the other side. Okay, but anyway, back to verse 5. When the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, "Watch out and beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." And they said to one another, "It's because we haven't brought any bread. We brought no bread." And becoming aware of it, Jesus said, "You of little faith, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive?" Do you not remember the 5 loaves, the 5,000, how many baskets were gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets were gathered? How could you fail to perceive that I was not speaking about bread? Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then they understood that he had not told him to be aware of the yeast of bread, but of the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Once again, the disciples come across as being pretty dense. Anyway, leaven was an image for 3 things as it's used in the Gospels. First of all, the ingredient that's added to dough to make it rise. Another is leaven could refer to teaching. That could be good or bad. He talked about people being leaven in the loaf of the society. But it also could just be evil influence. Jesus in this passage used the disciples having forgotten the bread as a jumping off place to talk about the influence of the Pharisees, their leaven, their evil influence in life. The disciples come across not as very bright, but I think they're meant to reflect those who are having a hard time seeing and hearing Jesus' message. The difference is they do eventually see and hear it. And that's the hope and the good news for the rest of us, that though we may be a little dense at this point, we will continue and eventually will get the message. Chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do the people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon of Jonah, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. And so Jesus pointedly asked the 12, "What do you think?" Yes, I know you've told me what people are saying, the general answers about who I am, but what do you think? And each of us really must ultimately choose not what we think, but what we do, how we will direct our lives, what will our values and priorities be as a result of what we think about Jesus and who he is to us. This cannot be answered with a generalized theological scriptural statement, cannot be answered with a church creed or a church membership or anything like that. It has to be answered in our own minds and our own hearts. Jesus insists on our commitment to follow and to let our lives reflect those values that he shows us, those things that are so essentially wrapped up with who he was and who he is. And Peter's response reflects an issue, a theological, ecclesiological issue that has long divided Protestant and Catholic Christians. This is the passage that many Catholics, Roman Catholics, will base their understanding of the Pope and the papacy and the role of Peter on that. Is the rock literally Peter? I know Cephas, which is interpreted Peter, means rock. And so there's a play on those words there. But is the rock literally Peter? And is this truly the foundation for the papacy? The keys of the kingdom entrusted to this one who's the Prince of the Apostles. What would that mean? Are the keys of the kingdom administrative power? Or are they the power of Peter's faith that has been verbalized, that he has spoken? As with many statements in the gospel, does this statement about, you are the rock and the keys of the kingdom and all this, does this go back to Jesus? Or in Mark's gospel, is that more accurate of the historical Jesus? Chapter 8, verses 27 to 30, in which this particular response by Jesus is not included. You go back and read that, and you can see that after Peter's statement, Jesus just tells him, don't say anything about my being the Messiah. Following Peter's statement, Jesus orders them just not to tell in Mark's gospel. Why did he order them not to tell? Or even in Matthew's gospel, after his long pronouncement, why does he tell them not to tell anyone? Going on to verse 21, it seems that the die has been cast for his suffering and death. Matthew 16, 21 to 23, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. This is such an important moment in this passage. Putting together verses 20 and 21, Jesus' desire for the disciples not to proclaim him Messiah leads right into his understanding that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer. And Peter, who had just expressed his faith so eloquently, to whom Jesus apparently had entrusted the capacity, the keys of the kingdom to bind or loose, now Peter allows his passion, his fear particularly, to control him. Don't do that, Jesus. And that's when Jesus calls Peter Satan. We can't overstate how big that is. Most Jewish people looked anxiously for the coming of the Messiah with God's new kingdom. They expected a great military-type victory, such as we see time and time again in the Old Testament, with the judges, with Joshua. Matthew and Mark both you see as their model, at least Jesus' model, for Messiah to be Isaiah's suffering servant, beginning in about the 40th chapter of Isaiah, the suffering servant as the model for messianic triumph. It would look different than a militaristic type victory. Jesus was not thinking God's thoughts, but reflecting the politics of his time. I'm sorry, that's a misprint. Peter was not reflecting God's thoughts. Jesus, of course, was. But he was reflecting those politics of the time, his own understanding of what the Messiah would be. He, in that sense, became a stumbling block to Jesus, maybe challenging Jesus' own resolve. Remember the temptations from the wilderness and the three temptations by Satan there. So many had to do with taking shortcuts toward the end of his ministry, toward how this would turn out. And again, I think Peter was tempting him. The stumbling block was putting that temptation in front of Jesus to choose an easier way, to use that power to just take the rule by force. And in Matthew 16, 24 to 28, then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. There is so much in this last paragraph, series of verses in chapter 16. What true discipleship means, as Jesus articulates it, is to let go of our anxiety, our fear, our politics, and do what Jesus says. He knew that the path to new life was through not fearing death in any of its forms, in all its forms, including the suffering and death that he would be facing. The challenge of discipleship is to think God's thoughts, to learn to see the world and ourselves through the eyes of God, from the perspective of God, to see life from a perspective not of how things work in this world in terms of the values that we have here, but from the perspective of God's own life, what we might call heavenly values. Death is not to be feared. it is transition. It's a birth to this new realm, new spiritual life. That's what our faith is. What unites life and death is the development of our own spirits to grow as spiritual beings, to let go of what we've always thought was important, what we've grown up believing and being told was so important, not to seek to save our lives, to hoard them back, but to make them available for God's purposes. There is judgment, consequences for how we live our lives. So much the Bible talks about these, the reality of judgment, but that judgment has to do with how much we're willing to move into our fears, let go of some of those fears, and place our lives at God's disposal. What profits a man or a woman to gain the world but to lose his soul is not a question. It is a judgment on each of us. What do we truly value? How do we hide from God? And then finally, verse 28. What does that verse mean concerning what the kingdom means? Well, in the first century, it was taken literally. Before some there present would die, the early church believed that Jesus would come back in glory. Again, that kind of triumphant, militaristic triumph that, for example, the book of Revelation seems to show in that apocalyptic literature. When that did not seem to have happened by the time the Gospels are written, by the end of the first century, the church had to backtrack and began to call it metaphorical. And we've struggled with this our whole 2,000-year history, in which from time to time people have said, oh, well, Jesus is coming back now. In the year 1000, there was a mass migration of people to Rome because it was thought, well, if Jesus is coming back, that's where he's coming. And this literal second coming is something that many Christians pin their hopes on. Many others are very skeptical about what that means. Others just ignore it completely. But certainly in that first century, that's how they understood it. Okay, there's a lot here for us, but I hope you enjoyed this. We will continue in chapter 17 as we move through book 4 of Matthew on toward that teaching discourse of Jesus. God bless you.